A lone street sits silent under the crushing weight of high noon. The sun burns overhead, casting sharp shadows that stretch across the dust. Two men stand facing each other, perfectly still. Their fingers twitch just inches from their holsters. A dry wind rolls through, lifting grit into the air, swirling it between them like a warning. Somewhere in the distance, a door creaks. This is the moment we've all seen. The classic quick-draw duel, the heartbeat of every Western legend. You can almost feel it, can't you? The tension, the anticipation, the certainty that in just a split second, one man will outdraw the other and it will all be over in a flash of speed and skill. But here's the truth. This moment almost never happened. Not like this. Not clean, not fair, and certainly not the way the movies taught us to expect. Because the real Old West wasn't a stage, it wasn't choreographed, and it didn't wait for dramatic pauses or perfect timing. Most gunfights didn't begin with two men squaring off in the street. They started in confusion, inside cramped saloons, in the dark from behind cover, or worse, with one man not even aware a fight had begun. The idea of the honorable face-to-face duel? That's something shaped long after the dust settled, polished into legend by storytellers and filmmakers. So before that imaginary trigger gets pulled, we need to stop and ask a different question. If this isn't how it happened, then what really did? Somewhere along the way, the Wild West became a stage, and gunfights became performances. It didn't happen overnight. The image of two men facing off in a dusty street, waiting for the perfect moment to draw, was carefully built over time. Dime novels in the late 1800s were among the first to shape this idea, turning real figures into larger-than-life heroes and villains. Then came Hollywood, where storytelling demanded clarity, tension, and spectacle. Films and TV took those early exaggerations and refined them into something unforgettable. The quick-draw duel, clean, dramatic, and bound by an unspoken code of honor. But that version of events says more about entertainment than it does about history. Because on the actual frontier, gunfights didn't follow rules. They broke them. They weren't scheduled or agreed upon. There was no stepping into the street to make things fair. More often than not, violence erupted suddenly. A heated argument at a bar, a drunken insult taken too far, a long-standing grudge that finally snapped. And when it did, it was fast, chaotic, and deeply uneven. One man might already have his gun in hand. Another might not even see it coming. Shots were fired from across rooms, through doorways, or from behind whatever cover was available. There was no referee, no countdown, just survival. The truth is, the Wild West wasn't interested in fairness. And once you strip away the myths, what you're left with is something far more unpredictable and far more dangerous. Most gunfights in the Old West didn't begin with silence. They began with noise, a slammed glass, a raised voice, the sharp edge of an insult that went just a little too far. Picture a crowded saloon late in the evening. The air is thick with smoke, the floor sticky with spilled whiskey. Two men argue over a card game. Maybe it's money, maybe it's pride. At first it's just words. Then someone stands. A chair scrapes hard against the floor. Suddenly the room shifts. People start backing away. Not because they've seen this exact moment before, but because they know how quickly things can spiral. And then it happens. Not a dramatic pause. Not a warning. Just movement. A hand dives for a gun, sometimes clumsy, sometimes desperate. Another man reacts. Maybe a second, too slow. Maybe already reaching. Shots explode in a space far too small, deafening and chaotic. No one is counting who drew first. No one is thinking about honor. It's instinct, fear, adrenaline, all colliding at once. And it wasn't always anger that lit the fuse. Alcohol blurred judgment. Old grudges lingered just beneath the surface. Even small misunderstandings could ignite something deadly. In many cases, one person didn't even realize a fight had started until it was already too late. That's the part the legends leave out. Gunfights weren't carefully arranged. They were triggered fast, messy, and often without a clear beginning. And once they started, there was no controlling how they would end, which is exactly where the real danger began. If you had to survive a gunfight in the Old West, speed wasn't your greatest asset. Position was. The popular image tells us it all came down to who could draw first. But in reality, the man who won was usually the one who already had the advantage before the fight even began. He wasn't standing out in the open, waiting to prove something. He was watching, calculating, and most importantly, placing himself where the odds leaned in his favor. Imagine stepping into a narrow alley, the walls closing in on both sides. Visibility is poor, shadows stretch long, and every corner hides uncertainty. Now imagine one man already positioned there, partially concealed, aware of your approach before you even realize he's present. In that moment, speed barely matters. Awareness does. Most real gunfights happened at shockingly close range, sometimes just a few feet apart. There was no dramatic spacing, no 10 paces and turn. It was sudden, cramped, and disorienting. In crowded saloons, a table or a support beam could mean the difference between life and death. Outside, a hitching post, a wagon, or even a doorway became instant cover. And then there was surprise, the most decisive factor of all. Many men were shot before they even understood they were in danger. A preemptive strike, an ambush, a quick reaction from someone already prepared. Fairness didn't enter into it, because out here, survival wasn't about being faster, it was about being smarter, more aware, and already one step ahead before the first shot was ever fired, which raises an even more uncomfortable truth about what happened after that trigger was pulled. Everyone talks about who fired first. Almost no one talks about who actually hit anything. Because in the Old West, pulling the trigger was the easy part. Hitting your target, that was something else entirely. Picture the moment. Your heart is pounding so hard, it drowns out everything else. Your hands aren't steady, they're shaking, slick with sweat. The air is thick, loud, confusing. Maybe someone shouting, maybe a chair just crashed behind you. You draw, you fire, and you miss. Not by inches, but by feet. That wasn't unusual. It was normal. Firearms of the time weren't precision instruments. They varied in quality, in reliability, even in how they handled from shot to shot. Add in fear, adrenaline, and the fact that most people weren't formally trained, and accuracy dropped fast. Aiming under those conditions wasn't like standing still at a range. It was chaotic, rushed, and often blind. And here's the part that shatters the myth completely. The first shot didn't usually end the fight. Sometimes it didn't even come close. Multiple rounds were fired, often wildly, as both sides struggled to land a hit. Smoke filled the air, visibility dropped, confusion took over. In some cases, men emptied their weapons and still failed to connect in any meaningful way. So the idea of a lightning-fast draw deciding everything, it falls apart the moment you look at what actually mattered. Because speed might start a fight, but accuracy, or the lack of it, is what decided how long it lasted, and how unpredictable it could become once it was underway. Gunfights in the Old West weren't tests of courage. They were battles against fear. The moment a weapon was drawn, everything changed. The steady, thinking mind people imagine in those cinematic duels simply didn't exist. Instead, the body took over. Heart racing, vision narrowing, hands trembling in ways no one could fully control. In that state, even the simplest decisions became difficult. Picture a man caught off guard in a crowded room. He hears the first shot, but for a split second he doesn't move. Not because he's brave, but because he's frozen. It happened more often than we like to admit. Others reacted in the opposite way, firing wildly, not aiming, just pulling the trigger again and again in a desperate attempt to survive, and all around them, chaos unfolded. Gunpowder smoke quickly filled the air, thick and blinding. People shouted, chairs overturned, and bystanders scrambled for safety, sometimes too late. In tight spaces, there was no clear line between combatants and everyone else. A shot meant for one man could easily strike another. Confusion wasn't a side effect, it was the environment itself. What makes this even more unpredictable is how often simple human error decided the outcome. A missed step, a delayed reaction, a moment of hesitation or panic. Skill mattered, yes, but so did luck, sometimes more than anyone would care to admit. Because in the end, these weren't controlled duels or calculated contests. They were brief, violent bursts of disorder, shaped by fear and instinct. And once that chaos took hold, there was no telling how or who it would leave standing. Some of the most famous gunfights in the Old West didn't become legendary because of what actually happened, but because of how the story was told afterward. Over time, these encounters were reshaped, polished, and retold until they fit the image people wanted to believe. What may have started as a chaotic exchange of gunfire turned into a clean, dramatic showdown. Details were simplified. Uncertainty was removed, and in many cases, the men involved became larger than life. Their actions framed as bold, decisive, even heroic. But when you look closer, the reality is far less cinematic. Many of these so-called duels weren't fair fights at all. Some were heavily one-sided, with one person already prepared, already in position, already holding the advantage. Others were the result of careful planning, ambushes disguised as spontaneous encounters. Even in situations that appeared face-to-face, the conditions were rarely equal, distance varied, timing was uneven, and often multiple people were involved, turning what we imagine as a two-man duel into something far more complex. What's even more interesting is how these stories evolved. Participants themselves sometimes played a role, shaping their own narratives, emphasizing certain moments while leaving others out. Over time, those versions stuck, repeated and reinforced until they became accepted as truth. But the deeper you dig, the clearer it becomes the legend and the reality are not the same. And once you start peeling back those layers, you begin to see that the Wild West wasn't defined by heroic standoffs, but by something far more grounded and far more human, which brings us to what these stories have hidden all along. Some of the most famous gunfights in the Old West didn't become legendary because of what actually happened, but because of how the story was told afterward. Over time, these encounters were reshaped, polished, and retold until they fit the image people wanted to believe. What may have started as a chaotic exchange of gunfire turned into a clean, dramatic showdown. Details were simplified. Uncertainty was removed, and in many cases, the men involved became larger than life, their actions framed as bold, decisive, even heroic. But when you look closer, the reality is far less cinematic. Many of these so-called duels weren't fair fights at all. Some were heavily one-sided, with one person already prepared, already in position, already holding the advantage. Others were the result of careful planning, ambushes disguised as spontaneous encounters. Even in situations that appeared face-to-face, the conditions were rarely equal. Distance varied, timing was uneven, and often multiple people were involved, turning what we imagine as a two-man duel into something far more complex. What's even more interesting is how these stories evolved. Participants themselves sometimes played a role, shaping their own narratives, emphasizing certain moments while leaving others out. Over time, those versions stuck, repeated and reinforced until they became accepted as truth. But the deeper you dig, the clearer it becomes the legend and the reality are not the same. And once you start peeling back those layers, you begin to see that the Wild West wasn't defined by heroic standoffs, but by something far more grounded and far more human, which brings us to what these stories have hidden all along. The truth is, the real danger of the Old West was never in the showdown. It was in everything we've been taught to ignore. Strip away the myths, the slow-motion duels, the perfectly timed draws, and what you're left with is something far less predictable and far more unsettling. Gunfights weren't clean contests between equals. They were sudden, chaotic bursts of violence, often over in seconds, sometimes decided before they even began. Out there, survival didn't belong to the fastest hand. It belonged to the person who noticed something was wrong a moment earlier than everyone else, the one who chose the right position, the one who stayed just a little more aware, and sometimes it belonged to the one who was simply lucky enough to be standing in the right place when everything went wrong. Imagine how different that is from the stories we grew up with. No dramatic pause, no sense of fairness, just confusion, fear, and consequences that couldn't be undone. When a gun was drawn, it didn't create a scene, it ended one. And that's what made the frontier truly unforgiving. Not the legends, not the reputation, but the reality that violence didn't wait for you to be ready. It didn't give second chances or clean resolutions, but in understanding that something changes, the Old West stops being a myth and becomes something real, something human. And maybe that's why, even without the drama, the truth is far more compelling, because it reminds us that history wasn't written in perfect moments, but in imperfect ones that decided everything.